Hi, this is the last video I'm doing of places we visited in South Dakota, and we wound up our trip in Rapid City, South Dakota, and I was looking forward to it. I wanted to see what the biggest city in South Dakota looked like, but when we went there, we were less than thrilled by going around the town trying to find interesting things. But the one thing we did find that was interesting was that they have statues of the presidents of the United States, sort of in keeping with this theme of presidents at nearby Mount Rushmore. They have statues of presidents in various street corners in downtown Rapid City. And I thought it was actually a neat idea. It kept us there, and we wanted to see all the different presidents. We saw almost all of them. There were two or three we wound up not seeing for whatever reason. Well, I'll tell you what one of the reasons was. When we were in downtown Rapid City, I thought there was somewhat of an element of people drinking too much. And I don't hold that against people in South Dakota to do that. I mean, need to go out and have fun and stuff. And there were a couple of nice places that were like microbreweries that looked pretty happening. But we also saw people like overindulging and talking too loudly. And then, unfortunately, we saw several Native Americans that were really bombed out of their minds and walking on the sidewalk and were sitting on the curb. And it was pretty sad sight to see, and that was the reason we didn't see one of the presidents as we walked around. But I just wanted to show you what I thought was an interesting thing that they've done in Rapid City to make their downtown more interesting, and I think it's pretty unique and a good idea. So we're supposed to stay at the Hotel Alex Johnson, which is a quote-unquote historic hotel in downtown Rapid City. Booked it through booking.com, and when we got there, they had oversold and given away our room, even though we showed up at a regular time. And the only thing they could offer us was like a room with a single twin bed in it. And then we were going to be there for 2 nights and then move us to another room the second night, which was just not acceptable. So we backed out of that and we stayed at a hotel we had stayed at previously out by the highway outside of town where a lot of nice medium class motels are, and that's where we stayed instead. And at the base of the Alex Johnson Hotel, they had like a bar situation going on, and that was one of the places where I felt like people were enjoying themselves a little bit too much, and I don't know, it just wasn't our scene. But near the Alex Johnson, that was one of the streets where some of the presidential statues were. And then another thing we saw in downtown was this place called the Trinity Eco Prayer Park, which I thought was an interesting idea, kind of a mixture of church and state, but more on the idea of spirituality rather than a specific religion. So that was interesting. But the only people that were in the park when we were there were like kind of drifter type people hanging out in the little shelter there. So that wasn't the greatest thing. And then I thought this was a cool sign that we saw on the top of one of the buildings. And we were looking for items of interest, and so that was one of them. So let's get to the statues of the presidents. I'll do them in order historically. So, of course, George Washington is number one. And by the way, I felt like a lot of the statues were very good depictions or showed the various presidents in interesting ways that you might not normally assume from looking at pictures in history books or in Wikipedia. So I give credit to the sculptors who sort of put some originality into the sculptures of the various presidents. So this is George Washington. And then John Adams we missed because of, drunken people nearby, and it just wasn't worth it to go in there and take a picture of a statue. So the next president was Thomas Jefferson, easily recognizable, or more recognizable than most presidents. And then this is James Madison, and you could probably tell from the statue, he was short. He was the shortest president. Maybe he was like 5'3" or 5'4". He was very short. And then after him was James Madison, and pictures I've seen, I haven't seen too many pictures of James Madison, but I thought this was kind of an interesting way to pose, sort of topping his hat. Then we get to John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams. Don't know too much about him, but I'll tell you, when I looked at these various statues, it made me want to find out, learn a little bit more of the history and learn about various presidents. And then this is Andrew Jackson, who was cut from a different cloth and was from Tennessee. And then after him was Martin Van Buren. Andrew Jackson was president for 8 years, but Martin Van Buren was only president for 4 years, and that'll be the case for a lot of presidents in the 1800s. And then I don't have a picture of the statue of William Henry Harrison, but he was president for 31 days. He gave the longest inaugural speech in presidential history in a driving rainstorm, and they think he caught a cold and then pneumonia, from which he died, but there's also some speculation that he could have died of typhoid, but I don't have a picture of him. But then the next president is John Tyler, who was the vice president, and he took over for William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison's grandson, by the way, which I'll show a little bit later on, is Benjamin Harrison, who was a president late 1800s. So Harrisons did get to have a president serve full 4-year term. So I thought this was an interesting statue of John Tyler, who I guess was tall, and he's holding a violin here. And John Tyler, I was reading up a little bit about him, and I want to read more about him as well as some of the other presidents in this era. But his wife died in the White House. I think she was the first lady to die in the White House, and she was an invalid because at an early age, like in her 40s, she had a stroke. And then while they were in the White House, she had another stroke and died. So he, then a widower in the White House, but then he married. He holds the record for the biggest age difference between the president and his spouse. So he remarried. He wooed a young woman, Julia Gardner. They got married after he had asked her a couple of times, and she finally accepted. She was only 21. When she was the first lady. So he was 51, still not that old, but big age difference. And reportedly, as you would expect, she added a lot of life to the White House. And I think they had a lot of kids too. So that's John Tyler. And then James K. Polk came after him. And Polk was regarded as one of the better U.S. presidents. He was president while the U.S. was having westward expansion, and I think he was president while they had the Mexican-American War, where with the U.S. winning, we got a lot of land and new states were brought in, and basically the shape of the United States going out to the Pacific coast took shape under Polk. And reportedly, I don't know, it's sort of difficult for me to imagine, but he supposedly entered office, and he was a disciple of Andrew Jackson, but he came into office full of energy, but he got worn out the 4 years that he was president. So he decided not to run again. Probably could have won if he did, but he then went on a kind of a victory lap through the South, where he was from. He was from Tennessee, and during that trip, he contracted cholera, and he died the same year that he left office. So he died fairly young, I think in his late 40s. That's James K. Polk, and he's buried on the grounds of the Tennessee Capitol in Nashville. And then after him, Zachary Taylor, he was president, but he only was president for a year and a half or so, and he died in office of sort of a similar thing. Some people thought it might have been cholera, but others say it was an intestinal ailment that affected him and many of his cabinet members, but he died in office. So Millard Fillmore was his vice president, and Millard Fillmore came in and became president. And he looks like a modern president from the 20th century, but this was before the Civil War, before Abraham Lincoln. So he looked pretty knowledgeable, and this is a very nice depiction of him sitting with a book in his lap. And then Franklin Pierce from New England became president, and he just served one term. One of the reasons he only served one term is he was a Northerner who sympathized with the South, was willing to go along with slavery, and a lot of Northerners didn't like that. So he became a lame duck during his time in office and did not receive support to run for re-election. And sort of the same thing happened with the person who followed him, James Buchanan from Pennsylvania, also sort of sympathized with the South and drew the ire of other Northerners for doing so. And historians think he might have been the first gay president because he never married, and he had a close relationship with a senator from Alabama who has the same name as me, and they were supposedly very close, but historians can't totally nail that down, but there's strong suspicion. And so after him fortunately, Abraham Lincoln came along. And this is a nice statue of him depicted with his son, Tad, who's wearing a Union Army outfit. And I just thought that was an endearing picture. So you'll see this in a couple of the statues where the president is with one of his children or with a pet. So it's very warm and endearing, I think. And then Andrew Johnson followed Lincoln, and he drew the ire of everybody because he kind of tried to roll back what was gained during the Civil War and sort of letting things slide. And so that was the main reason he was impeached. Then they had to bring in U.S. Grant, who was a victorious Union general at the end of the Civil War, and so he was president for 8 years. This statue sort of makes him look a little on the short side. He might have been shorter. I think he was shorter than Robert E. Lee when they met at the Appomattox courthouse, so he kind of looked up to Lee, who he was victorious over. And then Rutherford B. Hayes followed U.S. Grant, another person in the same party as Grant. There were a lot of Republicans who were believers in the anti-slavery movement, but there were a lot of things that sort of left to flounder. I mean, I don't think a lot of presidents in the late 1800s really helped the former slaves get on their feet, but they presided over things. But I don't know how much they helped the African American cause. It's too bad. And then the next president who was elected was James Garfield, who also was a Union officer during the Civil War. And from what I've read, he might have been a really good president, but he was assassinated in office, so he became the second president to be assassinated. And he died in New Jersey. They brought him from the White House up to New Jersey so he could recuperate by the Atlantic Ocean on the shore. And they brought him on a train, and then they brought him to Elberon, New Jersey. And Elberon, the station was about a mile from the ocean, and in one night they built a track from the station to the oceanside house where they hoped he would recuperate, but probably would have survived today. But back then they didn't know about keeping things antiseptic. They were searching for the bullet in his body, and that probably caused him to have the opposite effect of getting better. So when he died, then I don't have a picture of the statue of Chester Alan Arthur, but I have done a whole separate video on him and where he lived in New York. So he was the vice president who took over for James Garfield. So if you want to learn more about Chester Arthur and see where he lived, you can watch a video I did a while back. And then he was not too well liked, so they didn't want to renominate him for president. So the next president to be elected was Grover Cleveland, who I also have done another video about, who was born in New Jersey, but he primarily grew up and established his law practice in Buffalo and then became governor of New York, all in quick succession, and was mayor of Buffalo, governor of New York, and president, like in the span of 8 years. But I don't think too highly of him. I read a book about him, and if you want to learn more about that, you can watch that video about Grover Cleveland, not my kind of guy. So he was in office for 4 years, and then he lost to Benjamin Harrison. Despite having a majority of the popular vote, he lost in the electoral vote very narrowly, but he didn't contest it. So Benjamin Harrison, who was the son of William Henry Harrison, became president for 4 years, and then the two ran again, and then Grover Cleveland won the next time and served 4 more years. Then after Grover Cleveland, it was William McKinley's turn, and I thought this was an interesting statue of him talking on an old-fashioned phone. I thought maybe this was sort of saying that the phone was invented around 1900, which is when he was president, 1898 to the early 1900s. But no, it was invented like 25 years before this, but phones were being more and more widely used, and this is what phones look like around the turn of the century. And he was also unfortunately assassinated in office, the third out of 4 U.S. presidents to be assassinated. So then Teddy Roosevelt took over for him as the vice president and then won election in his own right. So Teddy Roosevelt was president for like 7 years. And I believe he spent a lot of time in South Dakota, but I know he spent time in North Dakota, but he liked the Dakotas. So I would think they would view him favorably here in South Dakota. And then after him, William Howard Taft became president, and then I thought this was an interesting depiction of Taft. He was like the heaviest president. He was heavier than Grover Cleveland, and this shows him throwing out the first ball at a Major League Baseball game on opening day. So I thought that was a nice depiction of Taft, who also later became a Supreme Court. I think he became the head of the U.S. Supreme Court. So he's the only president to have done that. And then after him was Woodrow Wilson, who some people, his reputation seems to have become tarnished over time as it's become more and more known that he was a racist. It's unfortunate, but he was the president when World War I started. And then Warren G. Harding was elected after him, and Warren Harding won. He had one of the highest margins of victory entering the White House, and everybody had grand hopes for him right at the start of the 1920s. And this is a picture of him, the first one with a dog, a pet dog. But he died in office while he was doing a Western tour. He died in San Francisco, and he was only 57, but I guess he had heart problems and smoked too much and everything. And his people's opinion of him was going down, but I still think he could have had a successful presidency had he lived. But his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, took over for him. And I didn't know that Calvin Coolidge looked like this, but they're showing him with a saddle and a Western hat because he stayed at Custer State Park in 1927 for like 3 months and had a Western White House in Custer State Park in South Dakota. So he's viewed very favorably in South Dakota. And then after him was Herbert Hoover, who unfortunately was the president when the stock market crashed and the start of the Great Depression happened. So with this, I'll show you a short video clip of the next president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A cool statue with the networks. And now we'll take it home after FDR with the vice president, Harry Truman, who took over for FDR when he passed away during his fourth term in office, and then ran for re-election. And this is a famous picture that's depicted by this sculpture. It's of Harry holding a Chicago Tribune that the headline on the Chicago Tribune the day after the election was "Dewey defeats Truman." And he's smiling from ear to ear because, no, he defeated Dewey. So that's what is just a legendary faux pas in the journalistic world. And Harry Truman was the beneficiary. So following Harry was General Dwight Eisenhower, who was the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces during World War II. And he came in during the 1950s and oversaw the country for 8 years. He reportedly put in the shortest days of any president and played a lot of golf during his time. But there was a lot going on sort of broiling under the surface while he was president, including the buildup of the CIA and the military-industrial complex, which at the end of his tenure, he warned the next president, JFK, about. And JFK had a lot to deal with when he first came into office. It looked like everything was going to be sunny in the 60s, but JFK's term got off to a rough start, and with the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, and then a standoff with the Russians over having missiles on Cuba, and a lot seemed to revolve during his presidency around Cuba. But this is a statue in front of the Rushmore Hotel and Suites, which is probably a hotel we should have stayed at in downtown Rapid City. But he's holding the hand of his young son, John. And then the next statue is of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was Kennedy's vice president when Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and took over, served the rest of that term, and then was reelected in 1964 and served a full 4 years. And he could have run again, but he said that he chose not to run. He was very unpopular at the end of his tenure because of the buildup in Vietnam, which everybody felt was a losing proposition. So he's not viewed very favorably in history for that, although he did some good things in terms of civil rights. And then following him, this was an interesting statue of Tricky Dick, Richard Nixon, and it's almost like those eyes, the the whites around his eyes really lend a, I don't know, menacing atmosphere. But this was the man who would always wear a suit while he was sitting at his desk in the Oval Office. Of course, other presidents have done that too. JFK is one of them. But what was unusual about Nixon, among other things, was that I think he always referred to his wife by Mrs. Nixon. He didn't call her Pat, her name. And he believed in having a fire going in the fireplace during the middle of the summer while the air conditioning was on in the White House. So he was a unique person. So following Nixon, after he resigned from office, was Gerald Ford, pictured with his pet dog, and he's holding a pipe. Kind of a nice, warm statue of Gerald Ford, who was the only president who was never elected. He wasn't the vice president. He was appointed vice president after Nixon's vice president resigned, Spiro Agnew. And Gerald Ford was a congressman, and he was appointed vice president. And then he became president when Nixon resigned. And from my reading, I don't have a very good opinion of Ford. That he was on the Warren Commission that was put in place to determine whether Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole assassin of John F. Kennedy in Dallas. And he seemed to take it upon himself to be the conduit to giving updates of information to the CIA and the FBI during the Warren Commission's investigation, sort of giving them a heads up as to what findings they were coming up with. And it just seems like there was something conspiratorial about that, and the CIA and the FBI were never determined to be involved in the assassination at all, but it seemed like Gerald Ford was not an objective member of the Warren Commission. So he faced election versus Jimmy Carter in one of the worst elections you could ever imagine, and came out on top and served 4 pretty lackluster years where inflation really spiked and the country seemed to undergo a malaise that he stated as something that needed to be dealt with. And it just seemed like the ship was rudderless under Jimmy Carter. But this statue of him is a nice statue. He's still alive. He's like 98 or 99. And he's still chipper. And somebody took it upon themselves to use a magic marker and connect his 2 eyebrows. So it looks like he has a unibrow, which I actually think is kind of funny. I almost didn't recognize him when I saw this statue, but that's Jimmy Carter. Then he lost re-election to Ronald Reagan, my wife's favorite president, and the only one that she's willing to have her picture taken with. And Reagan, I think, was smarter than people gave him credit for and did a lot of things to try to reduce taxes, but at the same time, the national debt increased. But he was very instrumental in helping reduce the arms race, working with Mikhail Gorbachev from Russia. So I give him a lot of credit for that. And then Reagan's vice president of 8 years, George H.W. Bush, was then able to run for president, and he won and served for another 4 years, carrying out similar policies to Reagan. And then after that, George Bush lost to Bill Clinton, who was very charismatic and I think actually had some good policies, including fiscal policies, but he had a messed up social life and personal life with Hillary and Monica Lewinsky and everything, so that kind of marred his presidency. But he was a very good speaker and very positive. He was a disciple of JFK. And then after Clinton was in office, then George Bush Jr. came into office, and he served for 8 years. This was a pattern where Reagan served 8 years, Bush Sr. was another 4 years, then Clinton was 8 years, and George Bush Jr. was 8 years, followed by Barack Obama with 8 years. So there was a fair amount of continuity at the turn of the century into the 2000s. But George Bush Jr. was president when 9/11 occurred in 2001, and he was a little shaky, he was a little missing in action, but I think with the help of Rudy Giuliani, he regained his footing and got the country moving back together again. So that was the hallmark of his presidency. And then after his 8 years, then Barack Obama was elected. And this is a nice statue of Barack with his younger daughter, Sasha, on the night of his election, his first election to the presidency at the celebration in Grant Park in Chicago. And this is also in front of that Trinity Eco Prayer Park. And it's a very natural and realistic looking statue. So that's the last presidential statue that's in Rapid City right now. I have no idea what they have in mind for the statue for Donald Trump. That's the next one to be installed. But I do have an idea of what they could do for the current president, Joe Biden. They might have a statue of him stumbling up some stairs up to an airplane, because that just seems to be the lasting image of his presidency. So I hope you enjoyed seeing all these statues in downtown Rapid City. We did. It gave us something to look at when everything else was pretty normal, although they do have some nice microbreweries in the city. But you have to, be mindful of high school kids revving up their cars, driving up and down the streets, and drunk people walking around, and just you have to sort of be on your guard even though you're in western South Dakota. So thanks for joining me. I know it was a long video, but I hope you learned some things and appreciated it as much as I did making it. Thank you.